In a number of recent videos, I've said that there is one sense in which it seemed to me that July of this year, 2023, might be compared with July 1943, a month during the Second World War, when a German offensive on the Eastern Front was repelled by the Soviets at the Battle of Kursk. Not so much in terms of direct comparisons between the battle itself and the current battle. I've made such comparisons myself in the past, but perhaps comparisons of battles in two very different wars should be avoided. But rather in the fact that it does seem, from various historical sources and historical commentaries, that it was in July 1943 that the German leadership first properly sensed the realization, if you like, dawned on them that they were likely to lose the Second World War. Didn't mean that the war, of course, ended that month. Their response to the sense that they were losing the war and were likely to lose the war was, if anything, to intensify their various activities. And in October of that year, 1943, the German leaders actually called together a conference of various German officials in a town in Poland called Poznań, which appears to have been intended to try to bolster commitment within Germany in order to keep the war going. But the point is that up to July 1943, the Germans had believed, previously, that they were likely to win the war, and then when things began to go wrong, they still thought that they could perhaps either pull it off or fight on to some kind of compromise. In 1943, in July 1943, they began to realize that the most likely outcome was their outright defeat. And I think increasingly that is where we are now with the conflict in Ukraine. There's been a cascade of articles and reports across the media in the West and from US officials, especially US officials, which all strongly suggest that. And I would add that on the other side, on the Russian side, we're now starting to get comments which suggest that the Russians not only believe that they're going to win the war. I personally think that they thought that since at least the summer, autumn of 2022, when it became clear that the economic sanctions were not going to destroy the Russian economy, as many people had supposed. And when the Russian military began to gear up for a military campaign that would ultimately end in a Russian victory. I think that they always believed that from that point on, that they would win the war. But recent statements from no less a person than Vladimir Putin, which I'm going to come to later in this program, now suggest that the Russians not only believe that they're going to win the war, but that they all but know that they will. Anyway, before I come on to and discuss all this commentary and what it means, I'd like to just say a few more things about the situation on the battlefronts. We've had more attacks overnight in the Zaporozhye region, in Rabotino, near Rabotino, this village south of Orechov. Ukraine has made, I have long since stopped counting, attempt after attempt to capture this village. Ukraine seems to think that if they do capture this village, it will lead on eventually to other things. Little sign of that, in my opinion. No reason to think that. But anyway, they launched another attack on Rabotino. It was again defeated. More pictures of burning Bradleys. Of course, I can't be sure that these latest pictures of burning Bradleys, which of course come from Russian sources, necessarily show Bradleys burning after this latest attack. But the implication is that they do, and I don't see why I personally should question this. So another failed attempt near Rabotino. More fighting on the Vremevka ledge. This is this place on the eastern end of the southern front lines where Ukraine launched the offensive. That was where the offensive began on the 4th of June. I have long since believed that Ukraine assumed that they would be able to capture the Vremevka ledge, the entire Vremevka ledge, probably on the first day of their offensive, which was the 4th of June. Anyway, we're now 22nd July, a month and 3/4 from that point, and Ukraine has still not managed to dislodge the Russians from the Vremevka ledge. They made another attack, apparently, on a village called Staromayorsk on the Vremevka ledge. Reports suggest that they were pushed back again. And Ukraine launched what appears to have been a major sustained attack in the Bakhmut area, specifically attacking the Russian forces both on the northern flank near Berkhovka and on the southern flank near Klesheyevka, and also further north near the village of Orekhov Vasilyevka, which, by the way, has always been and continues to be under Ukrainian control. This is some distance from Artyomovsk, the former Bakhmut, but it's seen as an area which is part of the battle. Now, again, one gets lots of conflicting reports about what has happened, but the overall sense that I have is that none of these Ukrainian attacks in and around Artyomovsk have achieved anything except kill large numbers of Ukrainian soldiers. Perhaps the Ukrainians have gained some ground in one or two places, but I doubt that this is of any major significance. There's been a suggestion, incidentally, that the reason that the Ukrainians are launching these intense and perhaps even intensifying attacks in the Bakhmut area is because they sense that Ukraine, having itself now used cluster munitions, the American-supplied cluster munitions, that has been confirmed by the American media, and following the warnings that were given by the Russian Defense Minister, Sergei Shoigu, that if Ukraine did use cluster munitions, the Russians would retaliate by using cluster munitions of their own. It's been suggested that the Ukrainians are launching these attacks around the Bakhmut area because they know that if the Russians start to use cluster munitions on a big scale against the Ukrainian forces in the Bakhmut area, then that will be absolutely devastating. It will result in an even greater increase in Ukrainian losses. It could result, in effect, in another disaster for Ukraine, so that they need to gain ground as soon as they can in this particular area before those Russian cluster munitions, available in far greater quantities and far more powerful than those which the United States has provided to Ukraine, at least that's what the Russians claim. They need to make that progress before those Russian cluster munitions arrive. And in fact, there were reports early this morning, which I saw, that the Russian military is now taking cluster munitions out of store and that they're being transferred to the combat troops. Well, that may be, but I would repeat again that the clock is running down against Ukraine anyway. The Bakhmut sector is the weakest part of the Russian front lines because it's clear that they have laid quite a lot of minefields in this area. The Russians have not been able to fortify to the degree and with the sophistication that they have fortified other parts of their front line. The big Russian fortifications in this area, the Surovikin line, the fortifications with the dragon's teeth and the concrete pillboxes and the trenches and all of that, are actually well to the east of Artyomsk, the former Bakhmut, between the former Bakhmut and the town of Popaznaya, a fact which, by the way, reinforces the theory, or supports the theory, that when the Russians first launched the offensive towards Bakhmut in October, they hadn't actually anticipated that the Wagner group would capture the town. They thought that the fighting there would really, the purpose of the fighting there was really to delay any offensive that Ukraine might be intending to launch at a time when the Russians were reorganizing and consolidating and building up their fortified lines, and at the same time bleed the Ukrainians dry. Well, anyway, whatever. The fact is that this is the weakest, most exposed part of the front lines. So it makes a kind of sense, I suppose, if you persist in conducting an offensive, to do so in this area, rather than against the very heavy fortified positions that the Russians have elsewhere on the battle lines. Anyway, fighting continues around Artyomsk, the former Bakhmut. It's likely that the Russians will reinforce their troops there. The outcome remains obscure. It's clear that as at the time of writing of, rather time of making of this video, Klesheyevka, Kurdyumovka, all of these places, Berkhovka, all remain firmly under Russian control. Some reports, perhaps the more reliable reports that were circulating late last night and early this morning, suggest that all the Ukrainian attacks in this area have again been repulsed, but certainly the fighting here is intense, and it's likely that the Ukrainians will try again. Anyway, further north, around Kupiansk and Liman, it seems that after a brief pause, the Russians are on the move again. And this is the only part of the battle lines where the battle lines shift by kilometers at a time, where the Ukrainians are on the offensive. That is barely the case at all. Ukraine does make some gains, but it certainly doesn't achieve those sort of advances. But the Russians are making these advances. It seems that the story here has been of Ukraine rushing troops to try to stem the Russian advance towards Kupiansk and Liman, and perhaps buy time for Ukrainian defenses in this area to be shored up and for fortifications to be created. Anyway, the Russians brush off these counterattacks. Apparently there was a lot of that going on over the last 24 to 36 hours. And then they resume the advance, and they're closing ever closer towards taking control of these two towns, Liman and Kupiansk. Though, let me reiterate again what the Russian plans are at this time. It's difficult to say. The Russians also seem to have brushed off the latest Ukrainian counterattacks in Avdiivka, this town near Donetsk city, the place from where Ukraine has been shelling Donetsk city to a great extent, and the place which was the hub of Ukrainian defenses near Donetsk city, or perhaps more accurately, the hub of the Ukrainian attempt to essentially besiege Donetsk city, which has been an ongoing affair since the 2014 fighting. Anyway, it seems that the Russians have gained more ground. They're tightening the ring that is starting to emerge around Avdiivka, and it's possible that before long that ring will close or threaten to close, in which case, as I've discussed in previous programs, the Ukrainians have a difficult decision to make. Do they stand fast in Avdiivka, accept the possibility of their troops there being encircled? And it seems to me that in Avdiivka, an encirclement operation is precisely what the Russians are undertaking. Or do they pull their troops out, preserve them for another day, but accept the fact that Avdiivka itself is going to be lost and captured by the Russians, who will be in a position thereby to strengthen the position in Donetsk city and move on to the next important Ukrainian town, or Ukrainian-controlled town in this part of Donbass, which is Pokrovsk. But anyway, that's for the future. So the Russians are advancing, the Ukrainians continue to be at standstill, even though we talk about a Ukrainian offensive. And in the meantime, more missile attacks by the Russians in various locations across Ukraine, very heavy Russian missile strikes, continued missile strikes on facilities in and around Odessa and in the southern ports, some of these using supersonic Onyx missiles. The Ukrainians have admitted that they have no means to intercept these supersonic Onyx cruise missiles, even though, as I somewhat facetiously pointed out in my previous program, they claim to be able to intercept with Patriot missiles, admittedly, based in Kiev, but they claim that they can intercept the far faster, more advanced and more potent Kinjal hypersonic missiles. I'm not going to revisit that particular point. I made it before in my previous program. But anyway, the fact is the Russians seem to be continuing with their assault on the southern ports, and the Ukrainians have all but admitted that there's nothing they can do to parry this assault, though I will say that the attack last night seems to have been of a somewhat lesser intensity than the attacks that have happened on the 3 nights before, probably because most of the installations that the Russians wanted to destroy have now been destroyed. And on that topic, there's been comments apparently from Ukrainian sources that they've noticed a major increase in precision of Russian missile strikes and drone strikes. And this might be true. There's some question as to why that might be. It could be because Russian reconnaissance and surveillance is now better than it was. The Russians have more drones operating. In fact, they have far more drones operating than they did earlier in the war. The Russians have also built up a much more dense satellite array over Ukraine, monitoring what is happening over the course of the war. The fact, by the way, that the Russians had not put in place such a satellite array prior to the actual launching of the special military operation in February 2022 may be a clue that the decision to launch the special military operation was made rather in haste. But I'm not going to revisit that topic today. But of course, there could be other reasons, and I suspect one other reason why Russian attacks are becoming more precise is because the Ukrainian air defense system is now, to all intents and purposes, breaking down right across Ukraine. This is despite more American attempts to bolster it. The latest arms package that the United States has announced speaks of supplies of more Patriot launchers, more NASAMS air defense systems. The US is trying to plug the gaps, but by general consensus, these systems are less effective than the Soviet ones that Ukraine originally have, and significantly less effective than the Russian systems that the Russians are operating with today. And besides, there are nowhere near enough of them. So anyway, it could be that with the air defense system having degraded, the Russians are able to take time and launch their missiles more simply, knowing that more will get through. And it may be this, more than anything else, that is explaining the greater precision of the missile strikes that the Ukrainians are talking about. So, an altogether grim picture. President Zelensky has made various announcements. He says that the offensive is going to gain traction over the next period. He said this sort of thing before, and as I discussed in my program yesterday, if you put to one side the bitterly contested Bakhmut area, where, as I've said, General Syrskyi seems to be fighting his own private war, if you focus instead on the southern front lines, the places where Ukraine was supposed to achieve its great breakthrough, pushing south to the Sea of Azov, the reality is that Ukraine has gained no ground in this area at all. Not for several days, I suspect, actually, for more than a week now, perhaps even longer. But I'll come back to President Zelensky's comments shortly. Anyway, that's the situation on the battlefronts. Now, can I say there continue to be, in the Western media, swirls of rumours about purges of Russian military leaders connected in some way, perhaps, with the Prigozhin affair. There's been talk that General Teplinsky, the commander of the Russian airborne forces, has been sacked and is under investigation. There's been reports that other senior officers of the airborne forces who've been suspected of sympathy with Prigozhin and Wagner, that they've been sacked as well. The Russian airborne forces have now publicly denied those claims. They've said that all of the commanders who have supposedly been sacked remain in place. And there's some reports that suggest that Major General Popov, who had supposedly been sacked from the 58th Army and transferred to Syria, that actually all of those reports were wrong, and that after some pushback, the decision was made to reinstate him, and that he remains the commander of the 58th Army. I'm not able to comment on this at all, but anyway, there we go. And the fact that all of these reports have been circulating and have turned out to be wrong should perhaps make us even more cautious about accepting the stories that General Surovikin, the deputy chief of General Gerasimov's deputy as overall commander of forces engaged in the special military operation, the General Surovikin himself has also been sacked or is under some sort of investigation. I would say there's been no official announcement of this, and certainly no announcement that he has been dismissed from any of his posts, and no announcement of anybody replacing him, all of which leads me increasingly to the view that General Surovikin, who likes, unlike his Ukrainian counterparts, to keep a low profile, is probably still in post and continues to be very much in charge. But anyway, the airborne forces have said that one should pay no heed to many of these reports, which they attribute to Ukrainian propaganda outlets, various outlets, especially Telegram channels, which can be seen to be ultimately, or are known to be, at least by the Russians, to be ultimately controlled by Ukraine, including apparently a fake Telegram channel that is alleged to be connected with no less a person than Prigozhin, the head of the Wagner Group. Prigozhin, by the way, is apparently now in Belarus. Some of his troops are now in Belarus. There's all kinds of rumors swirling about what they might be used for. There's even a suggestion from a member of the Duma, the Russian parliament, that the Wagner troops might be committed in the event of an all-out fight between presumably NATO and Russia, that they might be committed to capturing the Suwalki Gap, a small land corridor linking Kaliningrad to Belarus, I presume. Anyway, there's been a lot of talk about this. I think that all of this is wildly in the realm of speculation. But whilst I'm talking about this, I might just wrap up on one particular issue which attracted quite a lot of attention in the Russian media yesterday, and which, in the absence of any other good news about the state of the war to cover, the British Ministry of Defence, in its latest bulletin, has made a big play about. And that is the arrest yesterday and the charges which have been brought by the Russian authorities against the blogger Igor Girkin. That's the last time in this program that I'm going to call him Igor Girkin. I believe that is his original name, but within Russia itself, he is universally known as Igor Strelkov. This was the name he gave himself in 2014 when he took charge for several months of the militia forces in Donbass, specifically in Donetsk, that were defending first Slavyansk and then subsequently Donetsk city from the original anti-terrorist operation launched by the Ukrainian military. And by universal consensus, Strelkov, who has no military background or experience, or at least if he does, it's very much in the special forces, but certainly no command experience. By general consensus, he conducted the defense first of Slavyansk and then of Donetsk with considerable skill, with great skill, and that made him something of a folk hero in Russia, until eventually, suddenly, in July 2014, he was sacked and replaced as head of the Donbass militia by other commanders who, by the way, proved at least as capable as himself. And there's been lots of speculation as to why that happened, all kinds of claims that Strelkov had fallen out with a pro-Ukrainian faction within the Kremlin. It was quite clear to me at the time that for all his undoubted talents as a leader, Strelkov was an extremely difficult individual, very prickly individual. He had fallen out with practically every other significant militia leader in Donbass. He'd made a host of enemies in Donbass. He'd made a host of enemies in Moscow amongst the political and military leadership there, who'd come to see him as something of a loose cannon. And on the part of the actual fighters and commanders engaged in the fighting in July 2014 in Donbass at that time, his departure actually came as something of a relief. And ever since then, my original assumption, my original belief, which, by the way, I wrote about, I've actually wrote pieces about this at the time, my original belief that Strelkov was a difficult person, very difficult to work with and get on with, and someone with political views which placed him on the very far right of the Russian political spectrum. Probably not popular in Donbass, where most people tend to identify more with the political tradition connected to the Soviet Union. Anyway, the fact that Strelkov was a difficult man with, shall we say, unusual and controversial political views became increasingly clear. He became a sometimes insightful but increasingly angry blogger, and his blogs over time have become sharper and ever more critical of the Russian authorities, and they become increasingly abusive about the Russian authorities, including President Putin, whom he's various times referred to as a coward and as a lowlife. And the result of this is that a lot of Strelkov's popularity, in fact, pretty much all of Strelkov's popularity with the wider Russian public, has dwindled away. He's become a rather marginal figure, not taken especially seriously in Russia itself, and certainly he does not have much support within the Russian military or within the militia in Donbass, which he once commanded. Now, none of this is to say that his arrest and prosecution is proper or justified. I suspect that his latest criticisms of Putin were just too much for some people. And also, he seems to have made enemies within the Wagner group. Well, he actually accused Prigozhin of treason when Prigozhin sought to launch his coup. So perhaps it's not surprising that he's made enemies within the Wagner group. Anyway, I'm not going to comment about the charges. They don't look to me particularly well-founded. I think that these charges are wrong and inappropriate. But I'm not frankly surprised, given the positions that Strelkov has been taking, that the Russian authorities have decided that enough is enough. His commentaries regularly get republished in the Western media and in Ukraine, giving the impression that the mood within the Russian military is bad and demoralised, as Strelkov repeatedly says. Anyway, I think that the Russian authorities have felt enough is enough, and they brought this very wrong and inappropriate prosecution in order eventually to push him aside. I suspect that eventually, by the way, he will be released, and I've seen people suggest a 5-year prison sentence. I doubt that that will come. I think the purpose of the Russian authorities, is to find some way during a war of getting Strelkov out of the picture. But anyway, the British Ministry of Defence says that Strelkov's arrest is going to infuriate people within the Russian military. Let me say, without qualification, it is going to do nothing of the kind. Strelkov has no sympathy or support within the Russian regular military, which he criticises continuously. He's got no support within the Donbass militia, which he once commanded, but whose other commanders, he antagonised. I think that all of these people, far from being dismayed about Strelkov's arrest, will heave a sigh of relief that he appears finally to be gone. So I just wanted to say that. I want to make it clear I don't like this case. It's a political case. Political cases are always wrong. But having said that, if you're talking about how this is going to influence the war, in my opinion, it's not going to influence it in the slightest. Now, that's all I'm going to say about Strelkov, unless there are more developments in his case, unless his case takes a really ugly turn, which it might do, in which case I will look at this case from a human rights and legal point of view, not from a political one, which, as I said, I don't think it has any importance at all. So that's the situation. Battlefronts, all static. Ukraine is gaining no ground. It is suffering increasingly heavy losses, and the situation for Ukraine continues to go from bad to worse. And the Russians are growing stronger, and Ukraine is going weaker. There's even said to be, I haven't seen it, so I'm not sure that this is correct, a report on Ukrainian television that admits that Ukrainian manpower reserves are close to becoming exhausted. But anyway, let's now deal with the various reports that are appearing about the war. And we've had a blockbuster one today in the Kiev Post, which is, of course, published in Kiev. I believe it's Western owned. It takes a fervidly supports Ukraine in this conflict. So it says headline is every 100 meters costs 4 to 5 men. Ukraine's frontline fighters report bloody battles, battered morale. Then the subtitle says Ukraine's grinding offensive is slowly gaining ground. As I've said, I actually think that is even true. I don't see any ground that is being gained. But anyway, that's to one side. Ukraine's grinding offensive is slowly gaining ground at the price of a continuous flow of dead and wounded. Soldiers say they will fight on, but morale is suffering with no quick end in sight. And then the article goes on to say, frontline Ukrainian soldiers told Kiev Post their units are suffering from poor morale because of constant and accumulated losses, sometimes poor support and limited summer offensive ground gains against a tough and deeply dug-in Russian opponent. Armed forces of Ukraine enlisted soldiers in individual interviews said slow, deliberate assault tactics currently used by the Ukrainian military have left individual fighters strongly suspecting they will be hit and possibly killed, well before a breakthrough on the front line can take place. And then it quotes a combat medic. The situation is very hard. The Russians were given too much time to get prepared for the widely announced Ukrainian counteroffensive. It was clear to them that one of the directions of the Ukrainian strike, if not the main one, would be Zaporozhye, and they prepared very well. Every square inch is mined. They plant mines on approaches to their positions and blow them up when they retreat. Nobody expected the whole terrain to be mined, so we've been banging our heads against the minefields, moving at a snail's pace. We really lose very many sappers. Those are the people who are supposed to clear the minefields. And of course, the more sappers you lose, the fewer people you have to clear the minefields. And remember, the Russians are able to see the minefields. They have means to place more mines automatically. They can launch them with all kinds of machines. And of course, if they start using cluster munitions, which they almost certainly will, that's going to pose for Ukraine another problem as well. And another soldier said that frontline Ukrainian units suffer slow drip losses. I don't see that they're slow drip. They seem to be very fast drip. Slow drip losses of dead and wounded, not just to minefields, but booby traps, shell strikes, tanks firing from the far side of a distant hill, drone-controlled artillery, and guided and unguided aerial bombs. And the soldier said that in his unit, soldiers are still willing to attack, but the ration of very little gained for fellow fighters killed or wounded was demoralizing. In 1 month, we've only advanced 1.5 kilometers. And then there's a ... That ... probably tells us that this soldier said that the major gains were in the first weeks. And then he goes on to say, we move forward by inches, but I don't think it's worth all the human resources and material that we have spent. And then there's a quotation, a Ukrainian major with extensive frontline experience and high level staff experience and speaking on the background, as anonymously, told the Kiev Post that the Ukraine military's total lack of an air force, limited reserves of artillery shells, and doctrine to preserve its own soldiers' lives, if possible. The latter, I don't really see how one can seriously claim it, but anyway, has left Ukrainian commanders with few other tactical options but launching short-range assaults against prepared Russian-held positions and accepting the cost in blood and lives. And this major has clearly been put up to say what he said by the Ukrainian command. He says that nonetheless the Ukrainians are inflicting losses and are hollowing out the Russians and are advancing. But as I said, I've seen absolutely no evidence of this. On the contrary, all the evidence suggests on the southern battle lines, which were supposed to be the key ones, a total stop in terms of Ukrainian advances. And on the contrary, as I said, it's the Russians who are gaining ground in the north and who are advancing and getting stronger in every part of the battlefronts. Anyway, that's the Kiev Post, and it's an English language newspaper, but it is published in Kiev itself. And then we have a very interesting report by Colonel, I believe he's a colonel, Richard Kemp, in the Daily Telegraph. Now, Richard Kemp and the Daily Telegraph have been, until fairly recently, incredibly optimistic about Ukraine's prospects in this war. Richard Kemp has passed up no opportunity at various times to say that things are going incredibly well for Ukraine, and he's relentlessly plugged the line that the Russian military is incompetent, demoralized, disorganized, inefficient, badly led, hopeless in all respects, and no match to that of Ukraine. Now, Richard Kemp is, as I said, a former British Army officer. He has, on occasion, given brief glimpses in his writings that, in fact, he takes a rather different view of events, that he's actually more skeptical about this propaganda of success in which he has himself participated. And I suspect that deep down, he's always had more doubts than he's been prepared to articulate. But anyway, his latest article is a sudden and dramatic shift of position. Its title in the Daily Telegraph is "Ukraine's counteroffensive is failing with no easy fixes." And he says Kiev complains that it doesn't have air power, but that is not the real source of its recent struggles. And then the article, I'm not going to read the entire article because it's behind a paywall, says, with no significant breakthrough, I'm going to read part of it, with no significant breakthrough after 6 weeks, it is worth asking whether Ukraine's counteroffensive can ever succeed, for it certainly doesn't look to be succeeding now. Compare the glacial but costly progress today. As I said, the progress is not even glacial. It's stopped. Glacial but costly progress today to the lightning victories at Kharkiv and Kherson last summer. The offensive in Kharkiv could be described as a lightning victory. The offensive in Kherson was not. As I remember, it took weeks. But that's another thing I just wanted to say. I'm not going to spend time on that. It's certainly not been the kind of grueling slaughter that we're seeing on the battlefronts now. And then he talks about and makes a very interesting admission. Back then, in the autumn, Kiev's forces were advancing against a withdrawing enemy that was pulling back to redeploy troops, trading space for time. Now, if you've been watching Brian Beletic's programs on the new Atlas at the time when those offensives were taking place in Kharkiv and Kherson region, that statement would not come as a surprise to you, because of course that was what Brian was relentlessly saying, continuously saying, and by the way was getting criticised for and getting a lot of pushback for. Months later, 10 months later, we have no less a person than Richard Kemp in the Daily Telegraph coming along and confirming that Brian Beletic's analysis, his commentary at the time of the Ukrainian offensives in Kherson and Kharkiv region last autumn, was right all along. I just wanted to say that because I remember Brian's videos from that period extremely well. And I also, by the way, remember Richard Kemp's and the British media's articles. And it's fascinating to see, yet again, how mainstream media falls into line with what so-called alternative, I prefer the expression, independent media, in that case, primarily Brian Beletic, was saying. So anyway, that's all I'm going to say. That's a bit mischievous, but that's what I'm going to say about that. And then Kemp goes on to say, having now built up their forces through mobilization and dug extensive defensive lines, which, by the way, Ukraine hasn't actually even reached so far, this time the Russians aren't going anywhere. And then there's a lot of comparisons between the fighting in Ukraine today and the fighting on the Western Front in World War One. I should say straight away that I think this comparison that many people are making with the trench warfare of the First World War is profoundly wrong. I think that completely misjudges the nature of this war, but again, that's a topic for another day. But anyway, Kemp repeats that, and then he says the question to be asked is, are the Ukrainians prepared militarily, politically, financially to carry out months and potentially years of these attacks to penetrate defensive belts of tank traps, barbed wire, minefields, bunkers, and trench lines? And the Ministry of Defence, the British Ministry of Defence, has described these fortifications as some of the most extensive systems of military defence works seen anywhere in the world. And he goes on to say that in the south, which appears to be Kiev's main effort at the moment, the terrain is mostly open farmland with few covered approaches, making surprise virtually impossible. And then perhaps the key paragraph, Ukraine is already outnumbered in every military capability. Its dire shortage of armoured vehicles means that Kiev is approaching this counteroffensive with immense caution. Many NATO-supplied tanks and infantry fighting vehicles were knocked out during early probing attacks, and they continue to be knocked out, by the way. And notice, again, the talk about probing attacks. We can put that aside. And they're constantly holding most of the rest of these assets back to avoid too many more losses. This is understandable, yet only a bold, concerted assault with massed armour is likely to overcome the Russians. In other words, go back to what they tried unsuccessfully to do in the first weeks of the offensive, and which they have sporadically attempted since then, revert to the so-called combined arms, armoured assaults, all of which have horribly failed. And then Kemp goes on to say, what is the main problem? Some in Kiev are pointing to the lack of air support, highlighting the reluctance of Western partners to provide F-16 jets. And then he goes on to say, Kemp says, but this would not solve Kiev's immediate dilemma. It takes months to train and then many more months to transfer the jets. Furthermore, as America's top general, Mark Millett, has already pointed out, the Russians have 1,000 fourth-generation fighters. If you're going to contest Russia in the air, you're going to need a substantial amount of fourth and fifth-generation fighters. We must recognise, and this is now Kemp, two things. This is not possible in the present context, and air power is not a magic bullet anyway. And then he comes back and says others have suggested that NATO planners and strategists should be more involved. They have been intimately involved every step of the way. They largely planned this offensive. No less a person than Victoria Nuland herself has told us as much. And then, of course, Kemp goes on to say, yet ultimately the possibility of a Ukrainian recovery comes down to its ability to complete frontal assaults. This strategy has been decried, by, at least since the First World War, by military theorists who rightly extol the virtues of the indirect approach, that is, advancing along lines of least resistance. to disrupt the enemy's equilibrium before attacking into weakened frontline defenses. But given Kiev's position, it does not have the privilege of philosophizing. The West should focus on providing the right practical equipment, such as demining kit, to clear paths through enemy obstacles, cluster munitions, and ATACMS long-range missiles. Well, we've talked about all of this many times before. It will take a focus on grubby land warfare and not sky-high dreams to tip the balance. All very interesting admissions. But late in the day, I noticed that Kemp, like so many neocons, he admits that it's all going wrong, but he says we should escalate. We should supply Ukraine with ATACMS missiles. There's now another interesting article in the Financial Times, and this article, also behind a paywall, leads with claims by President Zelensky that the offensive is in fact going to start picking up speed before very long. And this was said at an international conference. But it then goes on to say other things. And in fact, this is the more interesting part of the article, which is concealed behind the headlines. And we learned that Chrystia Freeland, Canada's Deputy Prime Minister, a fervent supporter of Ukraine, by the way, and somebody with Ukrainian roots, which have been much discussed. I'm not going to talk about them now. Apparently told Zelensky that the progress of the counteroffensive is the question in the minds of everyone and the preoccupation of your friends in the world, which is in a way putting more pressure on Ukraine to continue with this offensive and with this particular slaughter. And then we have Jake Sullivan, who attended the same conference. It is at that, and he talked about the fact that Ukraine hasn't yet committed its full forces. That may not be true, by the way, but he says it is at that moment when they make that commitment that we will really see what the results of the Ukrainian counteroffensive will be. But then Sullivan talks about the fighter jets. And he says this, and this is according to the Financial Times: Ukrainian emphasis on securing supplies of advanced fighter jets for the counteroffensive are misplaced because strong Ukrainian and Russian air defenses prevent air power from playing a significant role in the conflict. By the way, that is a revolutionary admission coming from an American official. Up to now, the United States has staked everything, almost the entire shop, in terms of its military capabilities, at least for war on land, on air power. And what Sullivan now admits is that Russian air defenses, we can discount what he says about Ukrainian air defenses, are now so strong that air power is essentially ineffective against air defenses of the kind that the Russians have. And then he goes on to say, Sullivan goes on to say, the view of our military commanders is that the notion that F-16s would play a decisive role in this counteroffensive, given that fundamental reality, well, they have a different view than what you hear from Ukrainian voices. And then the Financial Times goes on to say that while officials projected an upbeat outlook for Ukraine's military progress in public, many were less sanguine in private. In other words, they think this offensive is failing. And there's a quotation from Philip Zelikov, a history professor and former diplomat. He says that the bad news is Ukrainians are moving towards what could be a winter of discontent. He pointed to the severe economic impact of the war and the already steep costs borne by the United States and other allies to keep Kiev's government afloat. I discussed that yesterday about how Ukraine is now financially completely dependent on the West, and the cancellation of the grain deal has made it still more so. And so that's what Zelikov says. And we learned that James Cleverly, the British Foreign Secretary, has told the Financial Times that there's a mismatch between Ukrainian expectations and Western commitments. And then, extraordinary admission, the West has other priorities, whilst Ukraine has a singular focus. In other words, the Ukrainians may be only interested in their own war, but the West doesn't have unlimited resources, and it must keep some back for other contingencies that may arise. And then the Financial Times goes on to say Biden administration officials' frustration with criticisms from Ukraine about the pace and assistance the US is providing was palpable. So the Americans are becoming increasingly exasperated by Ukraine about the bottomless well that of demands that Ukraine is insisting that the United States fill. And we've even got a statement from Sullivan dismissing what he described as caricatures of American decision-making, including notions that the administration was sitting around unwilling to provide things because we're worried about the Russians. The sheer magnitude of American assistance made it clear that the United States was prepared to take risks, but it is responsible for every member of NATO, including the United States, to think about Russian reaction when we choose to do something, because that matters for our security. It matters for global stability. So there is only a limited amount that the United States can do, and the implication is that the United States is now almost at the end of what it can continue to supply. So, growing pessimism in the West about the war, growing pessimism in Ukraine itself. We've been hearing about the terrible morale of the Russian army. The Kiev Post tells us that it's Ukraine's army which is starting to suffer from low morale. Soldiers are increasingly questioning why they should be sent into battle, likely to be wounded or killed, at best to capture a few inches of territory, failing to achieve any breakthroughs, and admissions from the likes of Richard Kemp that there are no answers, there's no solution to this problem that Ukraine is facing now, and that the offensive might very well fail, and is indeed failing, because of this enormous mismatch in resources between Russia and Ukraine. So that's the West. We've had a fascinating series of statements from President Putin. And here I'm going to read out what was said in full. Now, notice that this was said at a Security Council meeting. These meetings mostly take place in private. And Putin's comments were part of an exchange with his chief intelligence official, the chief of his intelligence arm, Sergei Narishkin, who is the director of foreign intelligence. In other words, Russia's primary intelligence service. Now, I should make it absolutely clear that this exchange was clearly prepared in advance and took place with the purpose of publication. So that the Russians clearly wanted this whole exchange advertised. Narishkin was told what to say. Putin had prepared his response in advance. But let's start with Narishkin. And he says that according to information provided to the service, that's Russia's Foreign Intelligence Service, by several sources, officials in Warsaw are gradually coming to an understanding that no kind of Western assistance to Kiev can support Ukraine in reaching its goals. Moreover, they're beginning to understand that Ukraine will be defeated it is only a matter of time. So that's what Narishkin says people are saying to each other in official circles in Warsaw, that they have come to realize that Western aid for Ukraine is running out, that it cannot achieve victory for Ukraine, and Ukraine is going to be defeated in the war, and that it is only a matter of time. And then Narishkin goes on to say this: in this regard, the Polish authorities are getting more and more intent on taking the western parts of Ukraine under control by deploying their troops there. There are plans to present this measure as the fulfillment of Allied obligations within the Polish-Lithuanian-Ukrainian Security Initiative, the so-called Lublin Triangle. We see that plans also call for significantly increasing the number of personnel of the combined Lithuanian-Polish-Ukrainian brigade, which operates under the auspices of this so-called Lublin Triangle. We believe that it is necessary to keep a close eye on these dangerous plans of the Polish authorities. So what Narishkin is saying is that the Polish government has quietly understood that Ukraine is going to lose the war, that developments to that effect are now irreversible, that Western aid is not going to change the position, and that officials within Warsaw are now considering an active military advance by the Ukrainian military under the cover, the Polish military rather, under the cover of this security agreement with Lithuania and Ukraine, that they're going to advance into Western Ukraine and that they're going to occupy Western Ukraine, and that this is now a plan which is crystallizing and which is actually being prepared for action. So that's already a very interesting development. It tells us that the Russians now believe that the Poles have a plan to occupy Western Ukraine and that they're preparing to act on it. And then this is what Putin said. Yes, we should elaborate on what Mr. Narishkin has just said. This information has already appeared in the European media, in particular the French. I believe it would be suitable in this context to remind everyone about several history lessons from the 20th century. And this is, of course, Putin, the most historically minded leader in the world. He goes back to history repeatedly. And in this, by the way, he is very like his nation. Few nations are as historically minded, particularly about their recent history, as the Russians are. Anyway, this is what he goes to say. It is clear today that the Western curators of the Kiev regime are certainly disappointed with the results of the counteroffensive that the current Ukrainian authorities announced in previous months. There are no results, at least for now. The colossal resources that were pumped into the Kiev regime, the supply of Western weapons such as tanks, artillery, armoured vehicles and missiles, and the deployment of thousands of foreign mercenaries and advisors who were most actively used in attempts to break through the front line, the front of our army, are not helping. Meanwhile, the commanders of the special military operation, he means the Russian military, are acting professionally. Our soldiers, officers, and units are fulfilling their duty to the motherland courageously, steadfastly, and heroically. At the same time, the whole world sees that the vaunted Western, supposedly invulnerable military equipment is on fire and is often inferior to some of the Soviet-made weapons in terms of its tactical and technical characteristics. Yes, of course, more Western weapons can be supplied and thrown into battle. This, of course, causes us some damage and prolongs the conflict. But firstly, NATO arsenals and stockpiles of old Soviet weapons in some countries are already largely depleted. And secondly, the West does not have the production capabilities to quickly replenish the consumption of reserves of equipment and ammunition. Additional large resources and time are needed. Now, the last has been said also by Brian Beletic, by Alex Vershinin, by Scott Ritter, by yours truly, many times, that Western reserves of equipment are not unlimited, and the West cannot match the Russians in production of weapons. Well, this is the first time that Putin himself has come out and spoken in this way and has said so. In fact, some months ago, he was actually denying it. He said that the West has large numbers of weapons it can send to Ukraine, it's running through its stock of ex-Soviet weapons, but it's still got plenty of weapons of its own, and one shouldn't assume that the West is going to run out of weapons anytime soon. Now, seeing the situation on the battlefronts, he's coming round to the view that even Western stockpiles of weapons, even stockpiles of Western weapons, are not unlimited, and he's come to recognise the limits of the West's own productive capabilities. Anyway, he then goes on to say, the main thing is the formations of the armed forces of Ukraine suffered huge losses as a result of self-destructive attacks, tens of thousands of people. And despite the constant raids and the incessant waves of total mobilization in Ukrainian cities and villages, it is increasingly difficult for the current regime to send new soldiers to the front. The country's mobilization resource is being depleted. In other words, Ukraine is running out of men. And there are reports that even now, in frontline formations, not reserve formations or territorial formations, we're increasingly seeing in the Ukrainian army older men. Apparently, there's even a story that the NATO was astonished when one of the soldiers that turned up in one of the NATO countries for training on how to use one of the tanks, presumably a Leopard 1, turned out to be 71 years old. I don't fully know what that is true, but anyway, it does seem that Ukrainians' resources of manpower are starting to deplete. And that, of course, is what Putin has just said. And then he goes on to say, people in Ukraine are asking a legitimate question more often. For what? For the sake of whose selfish interests are their relatives and friends dying? Gradually, slowly, but clarity comes. We can see public opinion changing in Europe too. Both the Europeans and European elites see that support for Ukraine is in fact a dead end, an empty, endless waste of money and effort, and in fact serving someone else's interests, which are far from European. The interests of the overseas global hegemon, he means of course the United States, which benefits from the weakening of Europe. The endless prolongation of the Ukrainian conflict is also beneficial to it. We know, by the way, that on the last point, the Council for Foreign Relations takes a different view. They don't think that the indefinite prolongation of the war in Ukraine serves American interests. But anyway, Putin takes another view. And then he goes on to discuss, again, American intentions, but then he continues. Massive efforts are being taken to stoke the fire of war, including by exploiting the ambitions of certain East European leaders who have long turned their hatred for Russia and Russophobia into their key export commodity and a tool of their domestic policy. And now they want to capitalize on the Ukrainian tragedy. I cannot refrain from commenting on what has just been said and on media reports that have come out about plans to establish some sort of so-called Polish-Lithuanian-Ukrainian unit. This is not about a group of mercenaries. There are plenty of them there, and they are being destroyed, but about a well-organized, equipped, regular military unit to be used for operations in Ukraine, including allegedly to ensure the security of today's Western Ukraine. Actually, to call things by their true name for the subsequent occupation of these territories. In other words, the occupation by Lithuania and Poland of Western Ukraine. The outlook is clear. In the event Polish forces enter, say, Lvov or other Ukrainian territories, they will stay there, and they will stay there for good. And we will actually see nothing new. Just to remind you, following World War I, after the defeat of Germany and its allies, Polish units occupied Lvov and adjacent territories that had been part of Austria-Hungary. With its actions incited by the West, Poland took advantage of the tragedy of the Russian Civil War, that's the conflict between the Reds and the Whites in Russia after the Bolshevik Revolution, and annexed certain historical Russian provinces. In dire straits, our country had to sign the Treaty of Riga in 1921 and recognize the annexation of its territories. Even earlier, back in 1920, Poland captured part of Lithuania, the Vilnius region, and a territory surrounding the present-day Vilnius. So they claimed that they fought together with the Lithuanians against so-called Russian imperialism, but then immediately snatched a piece of land from their neighbour as soon as the opportunity presented itself. As is well known, Poland also took part in the partition of Czechoslovakia following the Munich Agreement with Adolf Hitler in 1938 by fully occupying Czechin Silesia. In the 1920s, 30s, Poland's eastern borderlands, a territory that comprises present-day Western Ukraine, Western Belarus, and part of Lithuania, witnessed a tough policy of Polonization and assimilation of local residents, with efforts to suppress local culture and orthodoxy. I would also like to remind you what Poland's aggressive policy led to. It led to the national tragedy of 1939, when Poland's Western allies threw it to the German wolf, the German military machine. Poland actually lost its independence and statehood, which were only restored thanks in large measure to the Soviet Union. It was also thanks to the Soviet Union and thanks to Stalin's position that Poland acquired substantial territory in the West, German territory. It is a fact that Poland's Western lands are a gift from Stalin. Now, needless to say, this description of the events of the early 1920s and of the early periods of the Second World War and of the change in Poland's territorial boundaries following the Second World War is going to be heatedly disputed in Poland. In fact, there's been fury on the part of the Polish government. They have apparently called in the Russian ambassador. They have issued furious protests against all the things that Putin has said there. But the key to it is in these words: have our Warsaw friends forgotten this? We will remind them all of these events. And of course, what Putin is doing in this, actually, not exactly, not factually inaccurate account of this period of history, but nonetheless a very selective account of this period of history, is he's doing two things. He is, to some extent, playing Lithuania and Ukraine off against Poland. He's making Poland look like an aggressive predator to Lithuanians and Ukrainians, which might succeed. But he's also reminding the Ukrainians, of the Poles, of something else, that yes, they did lose all these Western territories, but they were richly compensated by territories in the West, which previously were German. And that the risk they run, and this is where all those references to Germany come in, the risk they run is that by reopening the question of Poland's eastern border, Germany might at some point be minded to reopen at least questions about Poland's western border, and might conceivably, even at some point in the future, perhaps not for a long time, start to challenge Poland's retention of territories which Germany regards as historically German. Anyway, he then goes on to say, Putin then goes on to say, today we see that the regime in Kiev is ready to go to any length to save its treacherous hide and prolong its existence. They do not care for the people of Poland or Ukrainian sovereignty or national interests. They are ready to sell anything, including people and land, just like their ideological forefathers led by Petlura, that's a Ukrainian politician of the Russian Revolutionary era, who signed the so-called secret conventions with Poland in 1920, under which they ceded Galicia and Western Volhynia to Poland in return for military support. Traitors like them are ready now to open the gate to their foreign handlers and to sell Ukraine again. In other words, if the Kiev regime, as Putin refers to it, hands over Western Ukraine to Poland, they are betraying Ukraine. They are acting as traitors to their own country. And then comes the warning. As for the Polish leaders, they probably hope to form a coalition under the NATO umbrella in order to directly intervene in the conflict in Ukraine and to bite off as much as possible to regain, as they see it, their historical territories, that is modern-day Western Ukraine. It is also common knowledge that they dream about Belarusian land. Regarding the policy of the Ukrainian regime, it is none of our business. If they want to relinquish or sell something in order to pay their bosses, as traitors usually do, that's their business. We will not interfere. I think that's a very important point. Putin is saying that if Ukraine hands over Western Ukraine, Galicia and all those territories to Poland, the Russians will not interfere. They will not become involved. That is a business between Ukraine and Poland. Russia has no interest in Western Ukraine. Now, this has been talked about and discussed a lot about what will happen to Western Ukraine. Putin has now made it clear that as far as the Russians are concerned, this is not their concern. But then he goes on to say this, but Belarus is part of the Union state, and launching an aggression against Belarus would mean launching an aggression against Russia. We will respond to that with all resources available to us. So if Poland is looking to capture Belarusian territory, which was formerly Polish before the Second World War, then Poland is at war with Russia. And when Putin speaks about Russia responding with all the resources available, he is specifically including nuclear weapons. And of course, Russia has now positioned nuclear weapons in Belarus. And then he goes on to say, Polish authorities who are nurturing their revanchist ambitions hide the truth from their people. The truth is that the Ukrainian cannon fodder is no longer enough for the West. That is why it is planning to use other expendables, Poles, Lithuanians, and everyone else they do not care about. I can tell you that this is an extremely dangerous game, and the authors of such plans should think about the consequences. Mr. Narishkin, I hope that your service, just as the other special services, will closely monitor the developments. So he's basically saying to the Poles, you're playing a dangerous game if you get yourself involved in Ukraine, Western Ukraine. Well, we're not going to interfere. If you attack Belarus, you are at war with us. And if you try to involve yourself in the current war between Ukraine and ourselves, we will smash you. You will only play the game of the West. And the West, as it has shown before, cannot be relied upon. They've used Ukraine, and Ukraine is being destroyed. They will use you. You will be destroyed, and they will abandon you to your fate, just as they've abandoned Ukraine. So that's the warning that Putin is giving to the Poles. If they press on with this, they risk reopening the question of Poland's western borders. The Germans might start to say, well, if you're going to take Lvov, what about Szczecin and places, and Wrocław, the former Stettin and Breslau? What about places like that? So that's dangerous for Poland to do. And if you occupy Western Ukraine, you might have more on your hands than you've bargained for. But if you attack Belarus, you're at war with Russia. And if you involve your army in the special military operation, you're again at war with Russia. And if that happens, don't expect the West to ride to your rescue. They didn't before, and they won't again. A stark warning. And all very interesting and very interesting warnings coming from Putin. And as I said, they've created a sensation in Poland, as one would expect that they would, and of course, as they were intended to do. Let me just finish, however, by making the essential point. Narishkin, and both Narishkin and Putin confirm in these comments that, in fact, Russia is winning the war. Victory over Ukraine is inevitable. Ukraine understands this. So does Warsaw. And as I discussed earlier in my program, judging by the commentaries that are now appearing, so increasingly does the West. Well, that's my program for today, a long one, but as I said, this has been an important month in many respects. More from me soon. Just to remind you again, you can find all our videos on our various platforms: Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin, Telegram. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, and by going to our shop and getting yourself the great things that you will find there. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to press the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon, and have a very good day.